In the sun-weathered heart of Wyoming, where dreams either bloom or wither beneath the endless sky, stands the once proud Morgan Ranch. Its owner, James Morgan, carries the weight of loss like the worn leather of his father's old saddle, familiar but heavy with memories. When he inherited the sprawling ranch, it came with a mountain of debt and a hollowness no cattle drive could fill. Now at 45, he's made his fortune back, but the victory tastes bitter without someone to share it. His solution is simple. A marriage of convenience to Sarah Collins, the new schoolteacher whose own dreams are slipping away like water through desert sand. But as autumn paints the ranch in gold, something unexpected begins to stir in the spaces between their careful words and cautious hearts. Could this practical arrangement be the key to healing wounds neither thought would ever mend? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Morgan Ranch's main house, its weathered cedar siding wearing 20 years of Wyoming winters like badges of honor. James Morgan stood at his office window, one calloused hand resting on the leather chair that had been his father's, watching his ranch hands guide the latest shipment of prize cattle through the eastern gate. The operation was running like clockwork, just as it had for the past 5 years since he'd turned everything around. His father's old saddle hung on the wall behind his desk, its brass fittings catching the early light. James didn't need to turn around to see it. He knew every scratch, every worn spot, every story etched into that leather. It was the last thing his father had touched before the heart attack that changed everything. The day the bank came calling, that saddle had been the one thing James refused to sell. The sound of hooves and cattle below drew his attention back to the present. Through the window, he could see Mike, his foreman of 15 years, directing the precise choreography of ranch work with the ease of a conductor leading a well-rehearsed orchestra. The Morgan Ranch brand was now synonymous with the finest beef in 3 states, their breeding program respected throughout the industry. The debt that had nearly ruined them was long paid off, replaced by healthy profits and a sterling reputation. But success felt hollow in the emptiness of the big house. The rooms echoed with absence of his father's booming laugh, of his mother's holiday gatherings, of the wife he'd lost before they'd had the chance to start a family of their own. The ranch's revival should have been a triumph. Instead, it was just another reminder of all he had to prove and no one to prove it to. James moved to his desk, sliding into the chair with the smooth motion of daily habit. The morning's correspondence waited in neat stacks: invoices, breeding records, auction notifications. His eye caught on the local paper, folded to show the school board's latest meeting minutes. The town's struggling elementary school needed repairs they couldn't afford. Again, he paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, as a thought began to take shape. Sarah Collins, the new teacher who'd arrived last spring, had been making waves with her innovative programs despite the limited resources. He'd seen her once at the general store, her arms full of books she'd bought with her own money. There was something about her quiet determination that had stuck with him. The solution, when it finally crystallized in his mind, was as practical as a business ledger. He had wealth, but no heir. She had dreams, but no means. It was the kind of arrangement that had built half the ranches in Wyoming, practical partnerships, forged out of necessity and mutual benefit. The fact that she was lovely in an understated way, with eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense, was beside the point. This would be a business transaction, nothing more. James set down his coffee and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He'd need to approach this carefully, craft the proposal with the same precision he used in his business dealings. No romance, no complications, just a simple exchange of security for stability. It was time the Morgan Ranch had a proper mistress. Again, someone to give it purpose beyond merely turning a profit. The saddle watched silently from its perch as he began to write. its worn leather holding decades of Morgan family history. His father had always said that a ranch without family was just land and buildings. Perhaps it was time to prove the old man right. The ranch's old ledger sat heavy in James's hands, its leather binding cracked and faded. He rarely opened it anymore. The numbers inside told a story he'd rather forget. But today, with the weight of his decision pressing on him, he found himself drawn to these painful records of the past. The pages fell open naturally to the summer of 2015, when everything had gone wrong. The drought had come first, turning the pastures to dust. Then the cattle prices had plummeted just as their loan payments doubled. His father's death that autumn had been the final blow, leaving James to face the circling creditors alone. The ink on those pages was smudged in places, whether from rain or tears he couldn't remember anymore. Clara had stood by him through the worst of it. His young wife had sold her jewelry, taken a job in town, worked alongside him in the endless struggle to keep the ranch afloat. She'd been the one to suggest selling off the north pasture, her practical mind seeing the necessity before his pride would allow it. "Land can be bought back," she'd said, "but only if we survive to do it." But they hadn't survived. Not really. The morning he'd found her collapsed in the garden, the doctor's words had been a death knell for more than just his wife. Heart condition, they'd said. The stress hadn't helped. James had stood in the cemetery, watching them lower her casket into Wyoming soil, knowing he'd failed them both. He'd sold everything after that, except his father's saddle and the core 1,000 acres that had been Morgan land since 1902. The bank had been eager to take the rest. He'd worked other ranches, learned new methods, made connections in the industry. When the chance came 5 years later to buy back the north pasture, he'd been ready. The rest had followed, piece by piece, until the Morgan ranch was whole again, larger even than in his father's day. The ledger's newer pages told a different story. Careful investments, strategic partnerships, innovative breeding programs. His father wouldn't have recognized half of what they did now, but he'd have respected the results. The Morgan brand on a steer meant something again. James turned to the latest entries, the neat columns of black ink showing profits that would have seemed impossible 10 years ago. He'd learned to be harder, smarter, more careful with both money and emotions. No more risks, no more trusting to luck or providence. Every decision calculated, every move planned, which made his current intention seem all the more out of character. A marriage of convenience was hardly modern business practice. But watching Sarah Collins at last month's town meeting, defending her students' needs with quiet passion, he'd seen something of Clara in her. The same practical determination, the same clear-eyed view of what needed to be done. But this wouldn't be like his marriage to Clara. He'd learned that lesson too well. This would be a partnership of equals, based on mutual benefit and clear terms. Sarah would have security, resources for her school, a position in the community that her current circumstances couldn't provide. He would have... what? An end to the solitude? Someone to share the burden of legacy? The ledger offered no answers to these less tangible calculations. James closed it carefully, running his hand over the worn cover. The ranch was stable now, profitable beyond even his careful planning. All he needed was someone to share it with, someone to help ensure its future, someone practical, intelligent, and uninterested in the messier complications of emotions. He stood, returning the ledger to its shelf beside decades of its predecessors. Through his window, he could see the school building in town, its paint peeling and roof in need of repair. Sarah would be there now, doing her best with too few resources and too little support. Perhaps it was time to make her an offer she couldn't afford to refuse. Sarah Collins stood before her classroom's single window, holding her teaching certificate in hands that refused to tremble. The morning light caught the gold lettering, making it shine despite the coffee stain in one corner and the slight tear along the edge. battle scars from 5 moves in 3 years, each one chasing the promise of a school that might last. The sound of chairs scraping across wooden floors echoed from the next room. The building was settling into its morning routine, all 12 students finding their places in the town's only remaining schoolhouse. Sarah tucked the certificate back into her desk drawer, smoothing it carefully before closing it away. That paper had cost her everything she'd inherited from her grandmother, but it had been worth every penny. "Miss Collins?" Tommy Jensen's voice carried through the doorway. "The roof's leaking again." She didn't need to look up to know where. The bucket they'd placed last week would need emptying again, 3rd time this month, and it was only September. The school board's last meeting had made it clear. There was no money for repairs, not with tax revenues down, and half the families moving closer to Casper for better opportunities. "I'll take care of it, Tommy," she called back, reaching for the mop she now kept behind her desk. At least the leak wasn't over any of the precious books she'd salvaged from yard sales and library discards. Her collection, meager as it was, represented 2 years of careful shopping and endless hours of repair work. The children were used to the routine now, moving their desks away from wet spots, sharing textbooks held together with more tape than binding, making do with what they had. Sarah had taught them to see it as an adventure rather than a hardship. "We're pioneers," she'd tell them, "just like your grandparents were, making something from nothing. That's what Wyoming was built on." But pioneers had help, she thought wryly, dumping the bucket's contents outside. They had communities that came together, barn raisings and harvest parties. These days, everyone was too busy surviving to worry about a struggling school on the edge of town. Her students deserved better. Bright minds like Katie Martinez, who could solve complex math problems in her head, but had to share a tattered pre-algebra book with 2 other students. Or Will Cooper, whose stories about ranch life showed a poet's soul hiding behind his shy smile. They needed more than one overwhelmed teacher could provide with a budget that barely covered basic supplies. Sarah paused at her desk, running her fingers over the lesson plans she'd stayed up late preparing. The paper was cheap, the kind that came in bulk from the dollar store, but the dream she'd written on it was solid gold. A proper library. Science equipment that wasn't left over from the 1980s, maybe even a computer or 2, so her students wouldn't fall behind the rest of the world. The morning bell rang, another thing that needed fixing, its tone more wheeze than chime. Sarah straightened her simple blouse, checked that her hair was still neatly pinned back, and put on the smile her students had come to expect. It wasn't their fault that the school board's last letter, still sitting in her top drawer, warned of possible closure by winter if things didn't improve. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice carrying the warmth and confidence she'd perfected over years of making the best of difficult situations. "Today, we're going to talk about possibility, about how a single seed can grow into something magnificent if it's given the right care and attention." She turned to write on the chalkboard, careful to avoid the spot where the surface had worn. Almost smooth. Behind her she could hear the familiar rustle of notebooks opening, the scratch of pencils being sharpened. These children, with their eager minds and resilient spirits, were her real certification, worth far more than any paper in her drawer. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, sending a shaft of light across her classroom. It caught the edge of her mother's old brooch, the one nice thing she allowed herself to wear to school. The light scattered, throwing tiny rainbows across her students' faces, and for a moment, Sarah could almost believe in magic. Almost believe that somehow, some way, she'd find a path to making her dreams for this school real. What she needed was a miracle. What she got, though she didn't know it yet, was about to be something far more complicated. A proposition from James Morgan that would change everything. The first draft of the marriage contract sat on James's desk like a challenge. His lawyer had raised an eyebrow at the request, but had delivered exactly what was asked for. a clear, business-like document that laid out terms of property, responsibilities, and mutual obligations. No flowery language, no romantic pretense. Just a practical solution to two separate problems. James straightened his tie, unused to wearing one on a regular workday, but this was business, and business required proper presentation. Through his window, he could see the school letting out, children spilling onto the playground like beads from a broken necklace. Sarah Collins stood at the door, ensuring each child made it safely to their waiting parents. Even from this distance, he could see the care she took with each interaction, a gentle touch on a shoulder here, a word of encouragement there. She managed her limited resources with the same precision he applied to his ranch operations. It was one of the things that had convinced him this plan could work. The contract had taken shape over several drafts, each version more refined than the last. She would get financial security, a proper home, and resources for her school. He would get a partner to help manage the ranch's social obligations, someone to ensure its legacy continued. The terms were generous but not excessive. 5 years minimum commitment, joint property arrangements, provisions for both parties' independent pursuits. Mike's truck pulled up outside the school, right on schedule. His foreman's youngest was in Sarah's class, which had provided the perfect opening. "Miss Collins," he heard Mike say, his voice carrying through the open window, "Mr. Morgan would like to discuss a proposition with you, if you have a moment." James watched her hesitate, saw the subtle straightening of her spine. She'd worn her best dress today. Mike had passed along the warning that a business meeting was coming, but it was at least 2 seasons out of style. The contrast with his own tailored suit would be stark, exactly the message he needed to convey. "Of course," she said, her voice carrying that teacher's clarity that cut through any distance. "Would Mr. Morgan prefer to meet at the school?" "He's offered his office," Mike replied, nodding toward the ranch house. "Thought you might appreciate the privacy." James moved away from the window, positioning himself behind his desk. The contract was safely tucked away in the top drawer. Best not to show that card too early. First impressions mattered, and he needed her to see him as a potential solution to her problems, not a threat to her independence. The clock on his wall ticked steadily as he waited, each sound marking a step closer to what could either be his smartest business decision or his greatest miscalculation. The future of the Morgan Ranch, and possibly the town school, would depend on how the next hour unfolded. When his housekeeper finally showed Sarah into his office, James was struck by 2 things: the quiet dignity she carried despite her circumstances, and the way she assessed his office with a teacher's observant eye, missing nothing. Yes, this could definitely work. The town newspaper lay folded on Sarah's small kitchen table, tomorrow's headline already typeset: "Morgan Ranch owner to wed local teacher." The words stared back at her, black and irrefutable in the gathering dusk. Martha, the printer's wife, had shown her the proof with barely contained excitement. By tomorrow, everyone would know. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she poured her evening tea. James Morgan's proposition still echoed in her mind, delivered with the same precision he probably used to negotiate cattle prices. His office had been exactly what she'd expected. Everything in its place, power carefully arranged like the ancestral photographs on the walls. A mutually beneficial arrangement, he'd called it, laying out terms as clear as her lesson plans. "You need resources for the school. I need someone to help manage the ranch's social obligations. Marriage would solve both problems." The china teacup had been her grandmother's, one of the few nice things she'd kept. Her reflection in its surface looked the same as it had yesterday, though everything had changed. The Morgan Ranch was the largest employer in the county. Its owner's wife would have influence the struggling schoolteacher could only dream of. The ranch's old barn could be converted into a proper schoolhouse, he'd said, watching her face carefully, with a library, science lab, whatever you need. He hadn't smiled, hadn't tried to charm her, just stated facts, like items in a ledger. The contract had been thorough. She had to give him that. 5 years minimum commitment, joint access to resources. Her teaching career not just permitted but actively supported. Everything spelled out in clean, careful typescript that left no room for misunderstanding. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Marion Webb from the school board stood on her porch, practically vibrating with curiosity. The news was spreading faster than autumn frost. Is it true? Marion didn't wait for an invitation. You and James Morgan? Sarah met her eyes steadily. Mr. Morgan has made a proposal. I'm considering it. Marion's expression shifted from excitement to calculation. As head of the school board, she knew exactly how dire their situation was. The Morgan Ranch has quite a few children of working age, she said carefully. Having them in school regularly would boost our attendance numbers significantly. And their funding, Sarah thought. Amazing how quickly marriage to James Morgan could turn her from a problem to be managed into an asset to be cultivated. The newspaper's headline seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision, a future trying to right itself before she'd even agreed. But she had agreed, hadn't she? Her signature on the contract was less than 2 hours old, the ink barely dry. James Morgan's handshake had been firm, impersonal, a business deal closed to everyone's satisfaction. By this time next month she'd be mistress of the Morgan Ranch and have resources she'd never dreamed of for her students. The wedding will be small, she heard herself telling Marion. Private. We're both practical people. Later, alone again with her cooling tea, Sarah traced the newspaper's letters with one finger. The article praised James Morgan's philanthropy, his dedication to the community. No mention of her beyond her name and position. That would change. Soon enough, everything would change. She'd done harder things than marry a wealthy rancher who wanted nothing more from her than her competence and discretion. At least this time, the sacrifice would benefit more than just herself. Her students' faces floated in her mind, their potential finally having a chance to bloom. Still, as she prepared for bed in her small rented house, she couldn't help wondering what else that carefully worded contract might end up costing her. The house keys felt foreign in Sarah's hand, heavy brass that had been polished to a soft glow by generations of Morgan wives. Mrs. Garcia, the housekeeper, had presented them, with a formality that bordered on ceremony. Each key carefully labeled in her precise handwriting. Front door, kitchen door, side entrance, back gate, a kingdom of locks, and now she was supposed to be their keeper. Your room is the blue suite, Mrs. Morgan, Mrs. Garcia said, and Sarah managed not to flinch at the name. They'd agreed to separate bedrooms, a detail not included in the public version of their arrangement. Mr. Morgan thought you'd appreciate the morning light for your lesson planning? The blue suite was larger than her entire rented house had been, with windows that overlooked both the distant mountains and the sprawling ranch yards. A desk, antique oak that probably cost more than her yearly salary, sat positioned to catch the dawn light. Everything spoke of careful preparation and consideration, right down to the new laptop computer centered precisely on the desk's leather inlay. The Wi-Fi password is in the drawer, Mrs. Garcia continued, her tone making it clear she found such modern conveniences slightly suspicious. Mr. Morgan had the internet connection upgraded for your teaching work. Sarah set her single suitcase down beside a bed that could have slept 4. Her few possessions would barely fill one drawer of the massive armoire that dominated one wall. Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. I appreciate your help. The housekeeper's expression softened slightly. Dinner is at 7 sharp. Mr. Morgan takes his meals in the formal dining room. A pause. The last Mrs. Morgan preferred breakfast in her room, but I'll join Mr. Morgan for all meals, Sarah said firmly. They had an arrangement to sell, after all. Unless school duties interfere. Mrs. Garcia nodded, approval flickering briefly across her features. Very good, ma'am. Will you be wanting to review the household accounts? Mrs. Morgan, the first Mrs. Morgan, always did so on Mondays. Clara. The first Mrs. Morgan had been Clara, and her presence lingered in every careful euphemism, every sidelong glance from the staff. Sarah had known there would be ghosts in this marriage, but she hadn't expected them to be quite so actively maintained. "Perhaps next week," Sarah said, moving to unpack her meager wardrobe. "I'd like to settle in first." Left alone, she tried to imagine herself belonging in this room with its subtle elegance and carefully curated comfort. The keys weighed heavy in her pocket, like anchors tying her to this new reality. From her window, she could see ranch hands moving cattle between pastures, their actions coordinated with the precision she'd come to associate with James Morgan's world. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. James stood in the doorway, still, in his work clothes, but freshly cleaned up. "Everything satisfactory?" he asked, exactly as if she were a client being shown a property. "Very," she said, matching his professional tone. "The desk is perfect for my work." He nodded, satisfied. "I've had the barn measurements drawn up. The architect can meet with you next week about the school conversion, if that suits your schedule." Business. This was all business. She could do business. "I'll review the preliminary plans this weekend and have some initial thoughts ready." "Good." He hesitated, then added, "The staff will follow your direction regarding household matters. Mrs. Garcia can be traditional, but she's excellent at her job." Translation: "Don't upset the careful balance of his well-ordered world." "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "I won't disturb any existing arrangements." Something flickered in his eyes. Approval? Relief before his professional mask settled back into place. "Dinner at 7 then," he said, and left her to her unpacking. Sarah turned back to her suitcase, removing her carefully wrapped teaching materials. The keys pressed against her hip, a constant reminder of her new role. Mrs. Morgan. She would have to get used to the name, just as she would have to get used to this gilded cage she'd willingly entered. At least this cage came with the promise of helping her students spread their own wings. The leather-bound photo album was heavy in Sarah's lap, its pages thick with history. She hadn't meant to find it. She'd been searching the library for books suitable for her older students when it had fallen from a high shelf, almost taking her and the ladder with it. Now, sitting in one of the library's worn leather chairs, she found herself unable to put it down. The first page held a sepia-toned photograph of the ranch house, newly built and proud against the Wyoming sky. A man who could only be James's. Grandfather stood on the porch, his wife beside him, both wearing the kind of stern expressions people wore for long exposure photographs in those days. But there was something in the way the man's hand rested on his wife's shoulder that spoke of tenderness beneath the formality. "That's Daniel Morgan and his wife Eleanor." James's voice came from the doorway, making her start. "They built this place in 1902, raised 6 children here." Sarah looked up, apology ready on her lips, but James waved it away. "Family history belongs to family," he said, the words carrying a weight she wasn't sure how to interpret. He moved into the room, standing behind her chair to look at the album. Turn the page. The next photographs showed the ranch growing, evolving, barns being raised, cattle drives, children on horses. Each image was carefully labeled in various hands, dates, names, occasions. The Morgan family tree spreading its branches through time. "Your father?" she asked, pausing at a photo of a young man who had James's jaw and bearing, standing proudly beside a prize bull. "Thomas Morgan," James confirmed, and she heard the subtle shift in his voice. "He modernized the breeding program, brought in new bloodlines. Everything we do now builds on his work." Sarah turned another page and caught her breath. A wedding. Photo: James, younger but unmistakable, standing beside a woman with laughing eyes and an infectious smile. Clara. This was Clara, captured in joy rather than euphemism and careful phrases. James's hand tightened on the back of her chair. "You can ask," he said quietly. "About her. It's allowed." "Tell me something happy," Sarah said, surprising them both. A good memory. He was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she loved thunderstorms, would drag chairs onto the covered porch and make me sit with her watching the lightning, said it was nature's finest show and we had front row seats. His voice held something she'd never heard before, a warmth that transformed it entirely. Sarah studied the photograph, seeing now the wildness beneath Clara's polished surface. A woman who would watch storms for pleasure would also sell her. Jewelry to save a ranch, would work alongside her husband against impossible odds. She fought for this place, she said softly. With you, yes. The word held volumes. Until it fought back. Another page turn revealed the ranch in crisis, cattle thin from drought, pastures brown and barren. The photos grew fewer, the labels scarcer. Then they stopped altogether for several years, as if the family's pain had been too deep to record. When they resumed, they were different. Clinical, prize cattle, new equipment. Business success documented with professional precision. No more family gatherings, no celebrations captured, just the steady march of progress and profit. And now? Sarah asked, touching the album's final empty pages. Now, we have you, James said matter-of-factly, playing your part, helping rebuild what was lost. He moved away from her chair, his professional mask sliding back into place. Speaking of which, the architect's drawings for the barn conversion came through. They're on your desk when you're ready. Sarah watched him leave, his steps echoing. Through the quiet house, the album lay open in her lap, generations of Morgans staring up at her. Not just a business arrangement, she realized, but a dynasty. A legacy she'd agreed to help preserve. She closed the album carefully, returning it to its shelf. Her hands lingered on its spine, feeling the weight of history beneath her fingers. Somewhere in this great house, James Morgan was probably already back at work, adding columns of numbers that never quite added up to happiness. Thunder rolled in the distance, an autumn storm approaching. Sarah found herself wondering if anyone still watched them from the porch. The broken barn door hung askew on its track, years of weather and neglect evident in its warped wood and rusted hardware. Sarah stood in the autumn sunlight, studying the building that had caught her eye for weeks. Unlike the rest of the ranch's meticulously maintained structures, this barn stood apart, forgotten and untouched. Its weathered red paint had faded to the color of old blood, and tall grass grew unchecked around its foundation. "Ma'am," Mike's voice carried a warning. "Mr. Morgan we don't use this building." But Sarah was already pushing the door. Along its track, the metal shrieking in protest. The interior air hit her like a physical thing, stale, heavy with dust and memory. Shafts of sunlight pierced the gloom through gaps in the roof, illuminating what had once been a horse barn. Old tack hung on the walls, and empty stalls lined both sides of a central aisle. "It's perfect," she breathed, seeing past the decay to what could be. The space was huge, with a hayloft that could become a library. The stalls could be converted to study areas, the central aisle a classroom. With proper windows, fresh paint, some repairs. "Mrs. Morgan." Mike's voice was firmer now. "This barn's been closed up since before the drought. Mr. Morgan has his reasons." But Sarah was already taking measurements in her head, calculating square footage, imagining possibilities. The architect's plans for a new school building had been practical, but soulless, all modern efficiency with no character. This, though, this had history, heart. "Sarah," James's voice cut through her planning. She turned to find him in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but his shoulders rigid with tension. "This building isn't part of the renovation plans." "It should be," she said, passion overriding her usual caution. "James, look at this space. The bones are solid. The location is perfect. Close enough to town for easy access, but far enough to give the children room to—" "No," the word fell. "Between them like a stone. The plans we discussed are more than adequate. This barn isn't available for discussion." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, the first crack in her careful compliance. "Why? What possible reason could there be to let a perfectly good building rot when we could give it purpose again? My reasons are my own." His voice had taken on that distant quality she'd come to recognize as dangerous. "The new building will suit your needs." "My needs?" The crack widened. "What about the children's needs? They deserve more than some sterile box dropped onto the prairie. They deserve a place with character, with history." "What they deserve," James cut in, "is irrelevant to this discussion. The barn is not an option." End of conversation. But something of Clara's storm-watching spirit must have seeped into Sarah during these weeks of marriage, because she found herself stepping closer, challenging his authority for the first time. "No, not end of conversation. This isn't just about the school anymore. This is about you hiding pieces of your life away behind locked doors and expecting everyone to pretend they don't exist." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Mike had backed away, leaving them alone in the dusty barn with their first real conflict crackling between them. "You want to know why this barn is closed?" James's voice was dangerously quiet. "This is where I found her. Clara. The doctor said the heart attack was quick, probably painless. She was brushing down her favorite mare, the one thing from her old life she'd kept when we married. I sold every horse on the ranch the next day." Sarah's anger drained away, leaving understanding in its wake. "And now, it's a tomb. It's a reminder," he corrected sharply, "of what happens when you let emotions override good business sense. Clara loved this barn, loved the horses. That love didn't save either of them." "No," Sarah said softly, "but it made them worth having in the first place." Something flickered in James's eyes, pain or recognition she couldn't tell. He turned abruptly, heading for the door. "The barn stays closed. That's final." But Sarah, standing in the shaft of sunlight that pierced the gloom, knew this wouldn't be the end. She'd seen too much possibility here, not just for the school, but for healing something long broken. Like the door hanging askew on its track, some things couldn't simply be locked away and forgotten. She pulled the door closed behind her as she left, its protest somehow less sharp than before. Time and patience, she reminded herself. She was beginning to understand that both would be needed in far greater quantities than she'd initially calculated. The stack of children's books on the ranch house's back porch looked out of place among the heavy wooden furniture and practical boot scrapers. Sarah had brought them from her classroom, intending to return them to storage. But Mike's youngest, son Tommy, had spotted where the red fern grows on top of the pile and asked if he could borrow it. Now, 2 weeks later, the porch had become an impromptu library. Ranch hands' children would stop by after their chores, exchanging books and lingering to discuss their favorites. Sarah found herself holding informal reading sessions in the late afternoons. The children sprawled on blankets in the grass while she read aloud. "The cowboys are listening too," Mrs. Garcia confided one evening as she brought out lemonade and cookies. "Not that they'd admit it, but they slow down their work when you're reading the exciting parts." Sarah had noticed. The men would find reasons to mend fence near the house during story time, their horses grazing while young voices asked questions about vocabulary and plot twists. Even the most weathered ranch hands would pause, pretending to check their tack while actually following the tales of frontier courage and loyalty. The changes were subtle, but unmistakable. Children's laughter, once foreign to the Morgan Ranch, now mixed with the everyday sounds of cattle and machinery. Homework was done at the kitchen table while Mrs. Garcia prepared dinner, the housekeeper's initial resistance softening in the face of young minds eager to learn. "Did you know Joey can barely read?" Mike approached her one evening after the others had gone. "My foreman's son, 12 years old, and the school in town just kept passing him along." The shame in his voice was painful to hear. "Dyslexia," Sarah explained gently. "It's not about intelligence. Joey's smart as a whip. He just needs a different approach." She hesitated, then pressed forward. "I could work with him if you'd like, before dinner, 3 times a week." Word spread. Soon she had 5 students for regular tutoring sessions, their parents grateful for the extra help. The ranch's rhythm shifted to accommodate these informal classes, and Sarah found herself writing lesson plans at the dinner table while James reviewed contracts and cattle records. "The men seem content," he observed one evening, watching her grade papers. "Production is up, actually. Fewer mistakes, better communication. Amazing what happens when people feel their families are cared for." Sarah replied carefully. She'd learned to speak his language. Productivity, efficiency, results. A ranch isn't just land and cattle, it's community. James was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Clara used to say something similar," he said finally, "about the ranch being more than just a business." Sarah set down her red pen, sensing a rare moment of openness. "Tell me." She started a Christmas tradition, having all the families gather in the main house. Said it wasn't right for the hands to be alone in their bunkhouses during the holidays. His voice held that same warmth it had when he spoke of storm watching. The year of the drought. She insisted on keeping it up, even though we could barely afford it. Said hope was worth more than money in hard times. She was right, Sarah said softly, thinking of her students' faces lighting up over new books, of Joey proudly reading a full paragraph without stumbling. She usually was. James stood abruptly, the moment passing. Speaking of expenses, the architect sent a revised proposal for the new school building. "More windows, as you requested. The cost increase is reasonable." But Sarah noticed he didn't immediately retreat to his office, instead lingering to listen as she explained Joey's progress with phonics. And the next day, a new bookshelf appeared. On the porch, solid oak built to withstand Wyoming weather. "Mr. Morgan had it made special," Mrs. Garcia explained, helping Sarah arrange the books. "Said if we're going to have a library, it ought to be proper." Sarah ran her hand along the smooth wood, feeling the care that had gone into its crafting. Not quite permission to restore the old barn, but perhaps a step in that direction. Like her struggling readers, sometimes progress had to be measured in small victories, in the spaces between words where understanding began to grow. The ranch's first aid kit lay open on the kitchen table, its contents scattered across the wooden surface like evidence of disaster. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the gash on James's forearm, while Mrs. Garcia hovered nearby with fresh towels and worried expressions. "The bull was spooked," James explained through gritted teeth. "Lightning struck too close to the pen. If Mike hadn't been there." "But he was," Sarah said firmly, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. "And now you'll sit still and let me finish this." The wound wasn't deep enough for stitches, but it would leave a scar, another mark of the ranch's cost written on his skin. She'd been reading to the children when the storm hit, the afternoon sky turning violent with frightening speed. Then Mike's shout had cut through the thunder, and she'd seen James thrown against the fence. She'd moved without thinking, the first aid kit's location coming to her automatically, one of those details Mrs. Garcia had insisted she know, though neither of them had expected it to matter. "You should have waited for the vet," she scolded. But her touch remained gentle as she applied the antiseptic. Playing hero with 2,000 pounds of frightened bull isn't exactly smart business practice. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Worried about the ranch's bottom line, Mrs. Morgan. Worried about its owner, Mr. Morgan." The words slipped out before she could catch them, heavy with more truth than their arrangement warranted. His eyes met hers, something unguarded in their depths. "Sarah," he started, then hissed as she began wrapping the bandage. "Sorry," she murmured, though they both knew she wasn't apologizing for the bandage. "Almost done." Mrs. Garcia had disappeared, Sarah realized. That sixth sense of hers for private moments, sending her to busy herself elsewhere. The kitchen felt suddenly intimate, rain drumming on the windows while thunder rolled in the distance. "You handled it well," James said quietly. "The crisis. Most people would have panicked. I'm a teacher. We're trained for emergencies." She secured the bandage with careful precision. though usually more along the lines of skinned knees and hurt feelings. Still, his good hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "Thank you." The touch was electric, unexpected. Sarah found herself noticing details she usually tried to ignore. The strength in his fingers, the way his shirt clung to his rain-soaked shoulders, the small lines around his eyes that deepened when he was in pain. "I should check on the children," she said, reluctantly drawing away. "They were frightened by the storm." "Of course." He straightened, professional distance sliding back into place. But as she reached the door, he added, "They're lucky to have you. We all are." Sarah paused, her hand on the doorframe. "Even when I argue about old barns." Especially then. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "Clara would have liked you, I think. Your determination. The comparison should have stung, but somehow it didn't. Perhaps because for the first time he'd spoken of Clara not as a ghost to be avoided, but as a bridge between past and present. "Will you tell me about her?" Sarah asked impulsively. "Sometime. Not the sad parts, I know those, but the good memories, the ones worth keeping." James looked down at his bandaged arm, then back at her. "Perhaps," he said slowly. "Over dinner. The children will want to know you're all right. But afterward, I'd like that." She smiled, understanding the effort behind the offer. "Try not to wrestle any more bulls before then." His quiet laugh followed her down the hallway, as warm and unexpected as his touch had been. The first aid kit would need restocking, she thought. And perhaps, like the bookshelf on the porch, this too was a small step toward something neither of them had planned for. The box of love letters fell from the high shelf as Sarah reorganized the study closet, its contents spilling across the floor like autumn leaves. She hadn't meant to read them, had started gathering them up immediately. But Clara's handwriting caught her eye, elegant and confident even in faded ink. "My dearest James," the top letter began, "another spring morning dawns on our ranch, and I find myself watching you from the kitchen window as you work with the new colts. You're so gentle with them, though you'd never admit it. It's the same gentleness I see when you think no one's watching. The way you check on the newborn calves, how you slow your stride to match old Buck's arthritic pace." Sarah's hands trembled as she read. This wasn't the practical rancher's wife from the photographs, or the tragic figure from ranch gossip. This was a woman deeply in love, seeing past her husband's careful defenses to the heart he tried so hard to hide. "I know the bank's pressuring you again," another letter read. "I see the worry you carry, the weight of your father's legacy heavy on your shoulders. But my love, you're not alone in this fight. Whatever comes, we face it together. The ranch isn't just land and buildings, it's our dream, our future. And dreams like those wild roses I insist on planting can bloom even in the hardest soil." The letters tracked their life together, the good years and the bad, the drought's slow stranglehold on their hopes. Clara's handwriting remained steady even as her words spoke of mounting troubles. "The ranch hands' wives brought food again. Today," she'd written. "They say it's to share recipes, but I know they're checking on us. You'd be proud of how this community pulls together in hard times. Remember that, my love, when the numbers don't add up. Some things can't be measured in dollars and cents." "Sarah," James's voice from the doorway made her start guiltily. "Mrs. Garcia said you were—" He stopped, seeing the scattered letters, color draining from his face. "I'm so sorry," she began, gathering them hastily. "I was organizing and the box fell. I shouldn't have—" "Read them." His voice was strange, tight with some emotion she couldn't identify. "What did you think?" Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "I think she saw you clearly. The real you behind all the practical business decisions and careful distances." James moved into the room slowly, as if approaching a spooked horse. He knelt beside her, picking up one of the letters. She wrote every week those last years, said someone needed to record the ranch's heart, not just its accounts. His finger traced the signature. "I never wrote back, too busy trying to save everything to see what I was losing." "But you kept them," Sarah said softly. "All of them. Couldn't bring myself to burn them with the rest." He glanced at her sharply. "The way I've been burning everything else she valued. The horses, the barn, the Christmas gatherings." Sarah held out the letter she'd been reading, the one about the wild roses. She wouldn't want that, any of it. These letters, James, they're full of life and hope and... She hesitated, then finished. Love. Real, clear-eyed love that saw all the flaws and difficulties and chose them anyway. The way you see the potential in that broken-down barn. His voice held a note she'd never heard before, something almost like humor, though his eyes remained serious. The way you've turned this ranch back into a community, despite my best efforts to keep it purely business. Sarah began, but found herself without words as James reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Clara was right. "About the wild roses," he said quietly. "They're still blooming, out by the old barn. Stubbornest things on the ranch besides maybe you." The touch of his fingers lingered on her cheek, and Sarah felt something shift between them, like a door, long rusted, suddenly creaking open. But before either could speak, boots sounded in the hallway, and Mike's voice carried through the house. "Mr. Morgan, that bull buyer from Colorado is here early." James's hand dropped, the moment breaking. He stood, professional mask sliding back into place. "We should talk," he said. "Later. About the barn and other things." Sarah nodded, gathering the letters carefully back into their box. "Later," she agreed, understanding that, like the wild roses, some things needed time and patience to bloom. The legal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official seal gleaming like a warning on crisp white paper. Sarah found it in the mail, pile as she sorted through the ranch's correspondence, her heart stopping when she read the first paragraph. The letterhead belonged to the state's education board, but the real threat lay in the careful legal language below. "Pursuant to recent allegations regarding the nature of your marriage contract, concerns about the ethical implications of your teaching position, potential conflicts of interest, pending review of your professional status." She was still, staring at it when James came in from his morning rounds, his boots leaving mud on Mrs. Garcia's freshly mopped floor. He stopped short when he saw her face. "What is it?" "Someone reported us," she said, her voice surprisingly steady as she handed him the notice. "They're questioning the legitimacy of our marriage, saying it's a business arrangement that violates ethical guidelines for teachers, that I'm using my position as your wife to secure unfair advantages for the school." James read quickly, his expression darkening. "Marion Webb," he said flatly. "Has to be. She's been pushing to get her niece installed as the new teacher since before you came. She was so supportive of our marriage," Sarah whispered, "said it would be good for the school, until you started succeeding. Until the ranch families began sending their children to regular classes instead of pulling them out for work. Until your after-school programs started showing real results." His jaw tightened. Success makes enemies, especially in small towns. The notice seemed to pulse in his hands, its threats reaching beyond their careful arrangement to endanger everything Sarah had built. Without her teaching certificate, the school project would collapse. The children would be sent to the consolidated school 30 miles away, or worse, drop out entirely. "They can't prove anything," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. The marriage contract was perfectly legal, but its intent wasn't. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, the weight of reality settling over her. "We wrote it as a business deal, James. Property arrangements, mutual obligations, terms and conditions. What real marriage starts with a contract like that?" He set the paper down carefully, as if it might explode. "I'll call the lawyers. We can fight this. And say what? That we're really in love, that this isn't exactly what they're claiming it is." She looked up at him, seeing the conflict in his eyes. "We'd have to lie, James, to everyone, including ourselves." The silence that followed was heavy with all the things they'd left unspoken these past months. The growing comfort of shared meals, the way he'd started lingering after dinner to hear about her students' progress, the moment in the study with Clara's letters when his touch had felt like something more than just part of their arrangement. Unless James began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of uncertainty. Unless what? Unless we weren't lying. The words came out slowly, as if he was discovering them as he spoke. Sarah, these past months, the ranch hasn't just been a business. You've made it a home again, the way Clara always wanted, the way I never thought it could be. But before he could continue, Mike burst through the door, his face grave. Mr. Morgan, you need to see this. The bank sent someone about the loan terms. They're saying with the marriage under investigation, the property agreements might not be valid. The whole refinancing could be at risk. Sarah watched the shutters come down behind James's eyes, the businessman replacing the man who'd been about to speak from his heart. I'll handle it, he said, already turning toward the door. Sarah, we'll talk later. She sat alone in the kitchen, the legal notice mocking her from the table. Outside, she could hear the children arriving for their afternoon lessons, their laughter a painful reminder of everything she stood to lose, not just her profession now, but this place, these people, and James, who'd been about to say something that might have changed everything. The bank documents spread across James's desk like a web of threats, each page highlighting another vulnerability in their carefully constructed world. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching him pore over the refinancing terms while the bank representative, a thin man named Harrison, tapped his fingers impatiently on his briefcase. As you can see, Mr. Morgan, Harrison was saying, the preferential rates were contingent on the stability of your domestic situation. A marriage of convenience, especially one arranged to circumvent educational funding regulations. He let the implication hang in the air. That's speculation, James snapped, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the papers. Our personal life is not the bank's concern. On the contrary, the Morgan Ranch's recovery has been remarkable, but it's built on careful financial planning that assumed certain structural stability. Harrison's eyes flicked to Sarah. If the marriage is invalidated, the property arrangements revert. The school project's funding becomes questionable. The risk assessment changes. Sarah felt sick. She'd known their arrangement was complex, but she hadn't realized how many threads James had woven together to make it work. The school, the ranch's refinancing, the careful balance of community interests, all of it depending on the fiction of their marriage. I need to make some calls, James said, his voice carrying that dangerous calm she'd come to recognize. If you'll excuse us, Mr. Harrison. But the banker wasn't finished. There's also the matter of the original loan from when you first saved the ranch, the one Clara co-signed. James went still. That loan was paid off years ago. The terms were renegotiated, yes, under the assumption of continued family ownership. If this marriage is legally questioned, Harrison shuffled through his papers. Well, there are clauses about material misrepresentation. The bank could technically require a full review of all past arrangements. Sarah watched the color drain from James's face. You'd go back that far, after all these years. The bank simply wants to protect its interests. Of course, if you and Mrs. Morgan could demonstrate the legitimacy of your relationship. Harrison's smile was thin as a paper cut. Perhaps a public renewal of vows, something to satisfy the community's concerns? The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. They could do it, Sarah realized. Stage a romantic ceremony, play the happy couple, convince everyone their marriage was real, save the school, the ranch, everything they'd built. But the cost would be the truth that had been growing between them. The real feelings that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with shared meals and quiet conversations, with the way James looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. I think, she said, her voice stronger than she felt, that Mr. Morgan and I need to discuss this privately. Harrison gathered his papers with deliberate slowness. The bank will need an answer by Friday. And Mrs. Morgan? The school board meets tomorrow about your position. I'm on the board, as you know. Such unfortunate timing. After he left, the silence in the office grew thick enough to touch. James stood at the window, his back rigid with tension. I'm sorry, he said finally. "I never meant for all this to touch you. The past, the debts, they were my burden to carry." "Our burden," Sarah corrected quietly. "Isn't that what marriage is supposed to be, even one that started like ours?" He turned then, and the raw honesty in his eyes made her breath catch. "Sarah, But once again they were interrupted. Mrs. Garcia appeared in the doorway, her face worried. "The school board's called an emergency meeting. They want Mrs. Morgan there in an hour." The moment shattered. James's expression closed off, the walls coming back up. "We'll finish this later," he said, already reaching for his phone. "I need to talk to the lawyers." Sarah nodded, gathering her dignity around her like armor. She had her own battles to fight now, and her students' futures hanging in the balance. But as she left the office, she couldn't help wondering if there would ever be a later that didn't come too late. The architectural plans for the barn's conversion lay spread across the kitchen table, their crisp blue lines stark against the worn wood. Sarah had worked through the night, fueled by coffee and determination, combining the architect's technical drawings with her own carefully researched proposals. Every detail was there, from the preservation of the barn's historic features to the modern amenities that would make it a proper school. "You should be resting," Mrs. Garcia said, setting down a fresh cup of coffee. The school board meeting went exactly as expected. Sarah didn't look up from her work. "They've suspended me pending investigation. Marion Webb is acting principal now." The words tasted bitter, but she forced them out anyway. "Which means I have nothing left to lose." The housekeeper's hand rested briefly on her shoulder. "You have us, Mrs. Morgan. The ranch hand's children are already saying they won't go to school if you're not teaching." Sarah's pencil paused over the plans. In the past 24 hours, she'd received dozens of messages from ranch families, all offering support. Mike's wife had organized a petition, even old Mr. Peterson, who hadn't set foot on the ranch since James's father died, had called to say he remembered when the barn had been the heart of the community. "Look at this," she said, pulling out an old photograph she'd found in the ranch archives. The barn hosted community gatherings before the drought, harvest festivals, Christmas celebrations, town meetings. It wasn't just for horses. It was where the ranch and town came together. The plans reflected that history. The main floor would house classrooms, but with movable walls that could open up for community events. The hayloft would become a library and computer lab, with broad windows offering views of both the mountains and the ranch yards. Outside, she'd designed gardens where students could learn about Wyoming's native plants and sustainable agriculture. "It's not just a school," Sarah explained, warming to her subject. "It's a community center, an educational hub for the whole region. We could offer adult education classes in the evenings, workshops on ranching techniques, cultural events." "Does Mr. Morgan know about this?" Mrs. Garcia asked carefully. "He's been in meetings with the lawyers all day." Sarah's hand strayed to the letter from the bank, now creased from multiple readings. "Trying to save what he can of the ranch's financing." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and both women looked up. The weather service had been warning about a major storm system moving in, but Sarah had bigger concerns than rain. "I know what everyone thinks," she said quietly, "that I married James for his money, that I used him to get what I wanted for the school, and maybe that's how it started. But now you love him," Mrs. Garcia finished simply. "Anyone with eyes can see that, and he—" "Mrs. Morgan?" Mike's voice interrupted from the doorway. He was soaked from the rain that had started falling. "Got word from town. The school board's called another meeting for tomorrow morning. They're voting on whether to close the school entirely, merge it with Casper Regional." Sarah's hands clenched. "On the architectural plans. They can't. The distance alone would mean half our students couldn't attend regularly." "That's probably the point," Mike said grimly. "Easier to control things when folks don't have options." The storm was picking up outside, wind rattling the windows. Sarah looked at her plans, at all the possibilities laid out in careful lines and measurements. Then she looked at the old photograph, at the barn in its glory days, full of life and community spirit. "Where's James?" she asked suddenly. "At the north pasture," Mike answered. "We've got cattle to move before this storm hits full force." He said not to wait dinner. Sarah was already moving, gathering the plans into her arms. "Mrs. Garcia, I need you to make some calls. Everyone who supported the school, everyone who remembers what this ranch meant to the community. Tell them to come to the school board meeting tomorrow." She turned to Mike. "And I need you to drive me to the north pasture. In this weather?" "Mrs. Morgan—" "Sarah," she corrected, surprising them both. "My name is Sarah, and I'm done letting other people write my story, or this ranch's story." She looked down at the plans, at her vision for healing not just a building, but a community. "It's time we all remembered what we're really fighting for." The drive to the north pasture was treacherous, rain turning the dirt roads to mud. Mike handled the truck with the skill of decades, but even he tensed when lightning split the sky directly ahead. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Sarah could make out shapes moving in the gloom. Ranch hands on horseback, working to guide, the cattle to shelter. And there in the midst of them, giving directions with the authority of generations, was James. She was out of the truck before Mike could protest, the architectural plans protected inside her rain jacket. The wind nearly knocked her over, but she kept moving, following the sound of James's voice through the storm. "Sarah." He turned in his saddle, face incredulous beneath his rain-slicked hat. "What are you doing out here? It's not safe." "Neither is hiding from the truth," she called back, fighting to make herself heard over the wind. "We need to talk about the barn, about everything." Another lightning strike illuminated his face, showing her the conflict there. "This isn't the time. It's exactly the time." She pulled out the plans, holding them up like a challenge, "because tomorrow morning the school board votes on closing the school completely, and I refuse to let them take one more thing from this community, from us." James stared at her for a long moment, rain dripping from his hat brim. Then he looked at his men, still working with the cattle. "Mike, get those beasts to the shelter. Dave, take over here." He swung down from his horse, handing the reins to his foreman. "Mrs. Morgan and I need to discuss some things." Sarah felt her heart leap at the determination in his voice. As they slogged through the mud toward the truck, lightning painted the world in stark flashes of clarity. Like their marriage, she thought, moments of brilliant illumination between long stretches of uncertainty. But for the first time since the legal notice arrived, she wasn't afraid of the storm. Some things were worth getting wet for, worth fighting for. And in the truck's cab, surrounded by the thunder of nature's fury, she would finally tell James Morgan exactly what his practical arrangement had come to mean to her. The new deed to the barn lay unsigned on James's desk, illuminated by flashes of lightning through the study windows. Sarah stood dripping on the rug, her architectural plans spread out between them like a declaration of war, or perhaps of independence. Outside, the storm raged with all the fury of a Wyoming autumn, but in the study, the silence was deafening. "You want to give the barn to the town?" James's voice was dangerously quiet. "The same people who are trying to destroy everything we've built?" "Not to the town," Sarah corrected, pushing wet hair from her face. "To the community. There's a difference, James. The barn would be held in trust, managed by a board of ranch families and town representatives. Independent from the school board, protected from political games." Lightning flashed again, throwing James's face into sharp relief. She could see the muscle working in his jaw, the struggle between the businessman who needed control and the man who'd started to remember what community meant. "It's still my barn," he said finally, "my property, my memories." "Your tomb," Sarah shot back, anger and frustration finally breaking through her careful composure. "That's what you've turned it into. A monument to loss that helps no one, heals nothing." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Clara wouldn't want this, James. You know she wouldn't." "Don't." His voice cracked like the thunder outside. "Don't use her to manipulate me." "I'm not. I'm asking you to honor her memory by bringing life back to something she loved. Those letters, James, she saw the ranch as more than just a business. She saw you as more than just a businessman. He turned away, staring out at the storm-racked landscape. And what do you see, Sarah? A convenient ally, a checkbook for your dreams. I see the man I fell in love with. The words burst out of her, too loud in the study's confines. The man who builds bookshelves for children's stories, who listens to his ranch hands' concerns about their families, who watches me teach from his office window and thinks I don't notice. James went very still, his back rigid. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. So was your marriage to Clara at first. Your father arranged it, didn't he? For the connections, the dowry to save the ranch? At his sharp look, she added, Mrs. Garcia told me, but it became real, James, just like this has become real. Slowly, he turned to face her. And when it became real with Clara, I lost everything. No. Sarah moved closer, close enough to see the pain and fear warring in his eyes. You lost Clara, and it broke your heart, but you didn't lose everything. You lost your way. There's a difference. Another lightning strike, closer now, made the windows rattle. On James's desk, the new deed seemed to glow with possibility. The bank, he began, knows exactly what they're doing, trying to use our past against our future. Sarah gestured to the architectural plans. But look at this, James. Really. Look, the barn becomes a community center, a place of learning and gathering. The ranch reconnects with the town, rebuilding relationships that have been broken since the drought. It's not just about the school. It's about healing something bigger than all of us. He studied the plans, and she could see his businessman's mind working through the possibilities. The trust structure would protect it, he said slowly, from both the school board and the bank, and with community investment, we could apply for historical preservation grants, Sarah finished, educational funding that doesn't depend on local politics. But more than that, she touched his arm gently, we could make it a place of joy again, the way Clara wanted. James's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. And us? He asked quietly. What happens to our arrangement? Sarah met his gaze steadily. I think we both know it stopped being an arrangement months ago. The question is, are you brave enough to admit it? To take a risk on love again? For a long moment, the only sound was the storm and their breathing. Then James reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. When did you know? He asked. That it had changed. The day you built that bookshelf on the porch, not because of the gesture, but because of how you watched the children using it, like you were seeing the ranch's future instead of its past. She turned her face into his touch. When did you know? When you argued about the barn. You saw. He bust my walls, just like Clara did, demanded better from me than I demanded from myself. His voice roughened. I've been afraid of losing you the way I lost her. Of watching another dream die. Dreams don't die, James. They change, like seasons. Grow stronger like storm-tested roses. Sarah smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Clara knew that. Maybe it's time we learned it too. James looked down at the deed, then back at her. In one swift movement, he pulled her close, his kiss tasting of rain and truth and possibilities. When they finally parted, he reached for his pen. Together? He asked, holding it out to her. Sarah took it, their fingers brushing. Together, they signed as witnesses to each other's courage, the businessman learning to trust love again, the teacher who'd found more than she'd bargained for in a marriage of convenience. Outside, the storm began to ease, as if nature itself approved of their resolution. The deed was no longer just a legal document, but a promise to honor the past without being trapped by it, to build a future neither of them had imagined when they'd first agreed to their practical arrangement. The school board meets in the morning, Sarah reminded him softly. James smiled, and it was Clara's storm watcher she saw in his eyes, the man who could appreciate beauty in nature's fury. Then we'd better get ready. I believe my wife has a presentation to make about the future of education in our community. Our community. The words settled into place like the final pieces of a puzzle, long unfinished. Sarah gathered up the plans, knowing they'd need to work through the night to be ready. But now they'd work together, not as businessman and teacher, not even as husband and wife, but as partners in something larger than themselves. The storm's last rumbles faded into distance, leaving behind air scrubbed clean of pretense. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they would face them the way Clara had always insisted the ranch work best. As family, as community, as love made manifest in actions rather than words. The first school bell rang out across the Morgan Ranch on a crisp October morning, its clear tone carrying on the autumn wind. Sarah stood in the doorway of the restored barn, watching students stream through the wide doors that no longer hung. Askew, the old horse stalls had been transformed into intimate study spaces, their wooden walls gleaming with fresh polish, while the main aisle served as a bright, airy classroom. Sunlight poured through new windows, catching the brass nameplate. By the entrance, Morgan Ranch Community School, where traditions grow. Below it hung a photograph of Clara, her smile as bright as Sarah remembered from the love letters, now displayed proudly in the library upstairs. James appeared beside her, slipping his hand into hers as Joey Martinez rushed past them, proudly, carrying his new reading workbook. Clara would have loved this, he said softly, watching the barn fill with life and laughter. Sarah squeezed his hand, remembering storm-watched roses and promises kept. She does, she corrected gently. Every time a child learns something new within these walls. The bell rang once more, calling their community's future to its first lesson in a place where past and present had finally found their peace. The new family portrait hung in the ranch house's main hall, taken 1 year to the day after the barn. School's opening. In it, James and Sarah stood on the porch steps, surrounded by their extended family, ranch hands and their children, teachers, community members who'd become as close as blood. The photographer had captured the moment just as the autumn wind lifted Sarah's hair, just as James turned to smile at her with unguarded affection. Mrs. Garcia paused in her dusting to study the image, remembering the careful distance that once defined the Morgan Ranch. Now, laughter echoed through the halls daily. The formal dining room hosted community potlucks. Even the garden boasted Clara's wild roses alongside the students' carefully tended vegetable plots. Through the window, she could see James and Sarah walking hand in hand toward the barn school, pausing to watch the sunset paint the buildings gold. They still had their practical sides, him with his ledgers, her with her lesson plans, but love had softened their edges, made room for dreams among the calculations. The ranch had found its heart again, and in doing so had helped heal a community. Not just a marriage of convenience after all, Mrs. Garcia thought with satisfaction, but a union of purpose, passion, and possibility. Exactly the kind of legacy Clara would have wished for her beloved home.